If this case is as clear-cut as it's been framed publicly, why does the court seem to be moving in the opposite direction? Because what's actually happening in the filings doesn't line up with what most people think is happening, and that disconnect is already shaping how this case will end. Once that gap becomes visible, the entire narrative surrounding Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and the people connected to this dispute starts to look very different. At first glance, the reaction surrounding this case has felt almost unanimous. Online commentary, entertainment coverage, and social media discussion have largely framed the situation as settled in spirit, if not yet in law. The assumption has been that the court process will eventually confirm what many people already believe. But courts don't operate on assumptions, they operate on records. This case, tied to Blake Lively, Ryan Reynolds, and Justin Baldoni, sits at the intersection of celebrity visibility and procedural reality. The involvement of Wayfarer Studios and the broader context of It Ends With Us has amplified attention, but attention does not translate into legal momentum. What's unfolding inside the courtroom is far quieter than the public conversation suggests. Filings, motions, and docket activity are often interpreted as directional signals, when procedurally they are part of a narrowing process, one designed to limit what can be argued later, not to preview outcomes. Understanding that difference is essential, because many conclusions being drawn now are based on how this case feels, not how it is functioning, and that's where this analysis begins. Before any interpretation makes sense, the first thing that has to be clarified is where this case actually is procedurally, not where people assume it should be. Despite the confidence surrounding public commentary, the dispute involving Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni remains firmly in the discovery phase. That phase is often misunderstood because it doesn't produce answers, it produces limits. Discovery exists to define what information can be used later, not to determine who is right or wrong. Courts design this stage to be methodical and slow on purpose. Both sides are required to exchange materials, clarify claims, and respond to narrowly framed requests. When disagreements arise over scope, relevance, or timing, judges step in not to weigh credibility, but to enforce rules. That distinction is critical because many of the filings people point to as turning points are actually procedural corrections. This is where perception begins to drift from reality. Docket activity increases, motions appear, and responses follow. From the outside, that activity can feel like escalation. Inside the legal process, it usually signals refinement. The court is narrowing what belongs in the record and removing what doesn't. Another important factor is what the public does not see. Judges review full submissions, including sealed materials and background context that never become part of headlines. Decisions made during discovery are based on that complete record, not on fragments circulating publicly. The presence of familiar figures like Ryan Reynolds, along with the involvement of Wayfarer Studios and the broader context of It Ends With Us, adds another layer of expectation. Visibility creates the impression that the case should move faster or feel more decisive. But courts don't accelerate because of attention. The same procedural standards apply regardless of profile. As discovery progresses, the case doesn't grow outward, it contracts. Each ruling clarifies boundaries. Each resolved dispute reduces uncertainty. Arguments that once seemed broad become more constrained. That contraction is subtle, but it's decisive, because once discovery defines the edges of the case, everything that follows is shaped by what survived this stage. And when discovery pressure increases and cooperation breaks down, the process doesn't stay technical, it moves toward enforcement, where the stakes become harder to ignore. Once discovery is underway, attention naturally shifts to the court record itself, not because it tells a story, but because it defines the boundaries of one. For many observers, the docket functions like a timeline. New filings appear, responses follow, and each entry is read as a signal that the case is advancing in one direction or another. But procedurally, the record isn't a scoreboard, it's a control mechanism. Its purpose is to document compliance, track disputes, and preserve a clear procedural history for the court. In this case, heightened focus on filings connected to Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni has led to repeated misinterpretation. Motions related to scope, timing, or presentation are often treated as substantive developments. In reality, they are frequently administrative, the court clarifying what belongs in the record and how it should be handled. Judges approach this stage cautiously. They avoid drawing inferences from presentation alone and instead focus on whether procedural rules are being followed. A filing that appears aggressive in public discussion may be routine in court. Conversely, a seemingly minor correction can matter if it affects how evidence is preserved or referenced later. This is where the gap between legal reality and public narrative widens further. Media summaries condense complex filings into headlines, often omitting the standards judges apply when reviewing them. As a result, the record becomes a focal point for speculation rather than a tool for organization. Another layer of confusion comes from visibility. Because the record is one of the few parts of the process the public can see, it absorbs outsized attention. What remains unseen, conferences, clarifications, and sealed exchanges, often shapes outcomes more decisively. The involvement of recognizable names and projects, including Wayfarer Studios and It Ends With Us, amplifies this effect. Familiarity increases confidence in interpretation, even when the procedural meaning is narrow. As the record continues to develop, it doesn't resolve disputes on its own. It limits them. It determines what arguments survive and which ones never reach consideration. And once those limits are in place, the focus shifts again, away from paperwork and toward the people whose testimony will anchor the record going forward. Because when the record stops expanding and starts locking in place, the next stage isn't about documents anymore. It's about statements that can't be revised later. Discovery changes fundamentally the moment it moves beyond documents and into testimony. Up to this point, most disputes revolve around written material, emails, schedules, filings, and formal requests. Documents can be clarified, supplemented, or corrected. Testimony cannot. Once statements are given under oath, they become fixed reference points that every future argument must align with. That's why this phase carries more weight than it appears publicly. Decisions about who testifies, what topics are covered, and what materials can be referenced shape the evidentiary landscape long before any ruling is possible. Courts approach these questions cautiously because testimony narrows flexibility in ways documents do not. In this case, the shift toward testimony brings additional individuals into procedural focus, not because of public prominence, but because of their proximity to the events being examined. Names such as Jamie Heath and Alex Sachs appear here for technical reasons: involvement in production oversight, communications, or decision-making chains relevant to the record. Judges set clear limits at this stage. They prevent testimony from expanding into speculation while ensuring that relevant facts can be established. This balancing act is designed to protect the integrity of the process, not to favor one side over another. From the outside, disputes over depositions can look confrontational or strategic. Inside the courtroom, they are calibrations. The court is determining which facts will anchor the case and which issues remain outside its scope. Another important shift occurs here. Consistency becomes mandatory. Positions that were once framed broadly must now align with sworn statements. Arguments that don't fit the testimony begin to lose relevance. Theories that seemed persuasive earlier may quietly fall away. As testimony locks in the factual framework, the case becomes more rigid, options narrow, interpretive freedom decreases. And once that framework is established, the dispute moves into its next phase, not about what was said, but how those statements will be interpreted, and who is permitted to guide that interpretation. Because once testimony defines the boundaries of the case, the court's attention shifts toward interpretation, and that's where flexibility becomes even more limited. As the factual record becomes more defined through discovery and testimony, the case enters a phase where industry structure begins to matter, not as a narrative, but as a legal framework. Public discussion often treats creative environments as informal or personality-driven. Courts do not. They evaluate roles, contracts, and authority as they are documented, not as they are perceived. This distinction is especially important in disputes connected to film production, where collaboration can obscure where legal responsibility actually sits. In this case, entities such as Wayfarer Studios and It Ends With Us establish how decisions were made, who held contractual authority, and where accountability is formally assigned. The involvement of Colleen Hoover as the author of the source material also shapes expectations publicly, but courts look past influence and focus on defined obligations. One of the most persistent misunderstandings at this stage is assuming that power dynamics automatically carry legal weight. They don't. Influence, reputation, or creative input does not equal liability. Courts require specificity, documented authority, contractual duty, and demonstrable action within that scope. This is why judges lean heavily on agreements, production credits, and internal structures rather than public reputation. The legal question is not who seemed influential, but who was authorized to act, and under what terms. That analysis often produces conclusions that feel counterintuitive to outside observers. Another factor courts consider is separation of responsibility. Large productions distribute roles deliberately to avoid overlap and ambiguity. That distribution can shield individuals from liability even when they are visible or involved creatively. Conversely, it can assign responsibility in places the public rarely looks. As discovery clarifies these boundaries, many assumptions lose relevance. Broad narratives about control give way to narrow questions about compliance. The case becomes less about the culture of an industry and more about the specifics of documented conduct. That narrowing can feel unsatisfying because it strips away interpretive space, but it is precisely this process that determines what the court will ultimately evaluate. And once those structural boundaries are firmly established, the next phase of the case turns away from authority altogether and toward how the record itself is allowed to be explained. Because once the court understands who had authority and where responsibility stopped, the focus shifts to interpretation and who is permitted to frame the meaning of what's already been established. Once the court has clarified authority, responsibility, and factual boundaries, the case moves into a more constrained phase, interpretation. At this stage, the dispute is no longer about gathering information, it's about explaining what the existing record means within defined legal standards. This is where many high-profile cases begin to feel opaque to outside observers, because interpretation operates under rules far stricter than public commentary. Courts rely on interpretation to bridge gaps between raw facts and legal conclusions, but that process is tightly controlled. Opinions must be grounded in evidence already admitted into the record. Speculation, inference, or narrative framing, no matter how persuasive publicly, has no procedural value here. This is also where expert involvement becomes relevant. Experts are not permitted to argue outcomes or introduce new facts. Their role is limited to explaining context the court may not possess directly, such as industry norms or technical practices. Judges scrutinize qualifications, methodology, and scope before allowing expert input to shape proceedings. In this case, as interpretation becomes central, the court's priority is discipline. Arguments must align precisely with the testimony and documents already established. Any deviation risks exclusion. This narrowing effect often surprises observers because it eliminates angles that once seemed central to the story. Another source of confusion arises when interpretive disputes are discussed publicly as turning points. Procedurally, they are filters. The court is determining which explanatory tools are acceptable, not signaling agreement with any particular interpretation. Media coverage struggles at this stage because interpretation lacks visible drama. There are fewer filings, fewer conflicts, and fewer moments that translate easily into headlines. As a result, public narratives freeze even as the legal process continues to evolve internally. What remains after this filtering process is a case that looks smaller than it once did, but far more precise. The questions before the court are no longer broad or philosophical. They are specific, bounded, and resistant to expansion. And once those structural boundaries are firmly established, the next phase of the case turns away from authority altogether and toward how the record itself is allowed to be explained. Because once the court understands who had authority and where responsibility stopped, the focus shifts to interpretation and who is permitted to frame the meaning of what's already been established. As the legal process becomes more constrained and technical, public attention often intensifies, and that imbalance creates a new layer of misunderstanding. Media coverage naturally focuses on what is visible: filings that can be accessed publicly, scheduled hearings, or recognizable names provide concrete moments to report on. But as a case progresses, fewer of its most consequential developments occur in ways that are easily observable. Conferences happen off the record, clarifications are issued without detailed explanation, key decisions are shaped internally long before they surface publicly. This is where the silence gap forms. In high-profile cases involving figures like Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and Reynolds, the absence of frequent updates is often interpreted as stagnation or avoidance. But procedurally, silence usually means the opposite. It suggests that disputes are being resolved within the structure already set, without generating new public filings. Courts do not fill this silence. Judges do not provide commentary to correct speculation or manage expectations. Their responsibility is to rule on issues presented to them, not to narrate the process. As a result, public understanding lags behind legal reality. This gap is widened by the way narratives solidify. Once an early interpretation takes hold, subsequent silence is filtered through that lens. Viewers assume their initial understanding remains valid, even as the court continues refining the case under a much narrower scope. Media outlets struggle here because procedural refinement is difficult to dramatize. There are no clear winners or losses to frame, and no simple explanations that fit within a headline. Yet this is often the period when the most decisive groundwork is laid. As weeks pass without visible escalation, frustration grows. Questions arise about why nothing seems to be happening or why outcomes haven't arrived. The answer is usually that the process is doing exactly what it's designed to do, just out of sight. And by the time something concrete becomes visible again, expectations have already hardened, setting the stage for the next moment of confusion. Because when expectations stop updating, but the legal framework keeps narrowing, the next visible development doesn't just inform the public, it challenges what they thought they already knew. By the time a case reaches this stage, something important has already changed, even if it hasn't been acknowledged publicly. The dispute is no longer expanding, it's compressing. Compression doesn't announce itself with dramatic rulings or public statements. It happens incrementally through decisions that limit scope, define relevance, and settle procedural disagreements. Each resolution removes another layer of uncertainty. What remains is not the full narrative people initially debated, but a much narrower set of questions the court is actually prepared to address. This is where many high-profile cases begin to feel anticlimactic. There are fewer visible developments, fewer filings to analyze, and fewer moments that feel decisive. But that quietness is not a lack of progress, it's the result of progress already made. As discovery disputes conclude and interpretive boundaries are enforced, the court's attention shifts toward efficiency. Judges are no longer sorting through competing versions of events. They are working within a defined framework, applying standards to a limited set of facts that survived earlier scrutiny. For the parties involved, this phase introduces a different kind of pressure. Once the case is compressed, options become clearer and fewer. Strategic decisions now carry more weight because there is less room to reframe arguments or introduce new material. The cost of continuing forward becomes more concrete, not just financially but procedurally. Public narratives often struggle to adjust here. Early expectations, formed when the case felt open-ended, don't shrink at the same pace as the legal process. Viewers continue to debate issues that no longer matter procedurally, unaware that the court has already moved past them. This misalignment creates frustration. It can feel as though the case is avoiding resolution, when in reality it is approaching it quietly. The absence of spectacle is mistaken for indecision. But compression is decisive. It determines which arguments remain viable and which ones are effectively off the table. By the time an outcome becomes visible, much of the work has already been done. Understanding this phase helps explain why later developments feel abrupt. They don't represent sudden change, they represent the final step in a process that has been steadily narrowing all along. Because once a case has compressed to its core issues, the next visible moment doesn't expand the story. It forces expectations to collide with the reality the court has already shaped. As the legal process continues to compress and refine the case, something else begins to stall: public expectation. Early on, uncertainty keeps opinions flexible. New information can still shift how events are interpreted, but once a dominant narrative takes hold, it tends to freeze, even as the legal framework continues evolving underneath it. That's the point this case has now reached. While the court has been narrowing the dispute through procedural decisions, much of the public conversation remains anchored to early assumptions. Initial claims, first impressions, and early coverage continue to shape interpretation, even though the legal questions before the court are now far more limited than they were at the beginning. Courts do nothing to correct this gap. Judges do not issue explanations designed to update public understanding or recalibrate expectations. Their role is not educational, it is adjudicative. As long as the process follows the rules, silence is normal. This creates a lag that's easy to misread. From the outside, the case appears stalled or unresolved. Inside the courtroom, it is moving steadily toward resolution under a framework that has already been defined. The most significant work is happening without visibility. In high-profile disputes involving familiar figures like Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, this lag is amplified. Familiarity breeds confidence. Confidence hardens into prediction. Prediction begins to feel like certainty, but certainty has no procedural value. As expectations stop adjusting, frustration grows. Viewers ask why outcomes haven't arrived, why the case feels stuck, or why developments don't match the intensity of earlier discussion. The answer is usually that the legal system has moved past the narrative stage entirely. By the time a concrete decision appears, it often collides with expectations that haven't updated in months. That collision is what makes outcomes feel surprising, even when they are the logical result of a long, quiet process. Because when the legal process finally produces something visible, the shock isn't in the decision itself, it's in how far perception drifted before it arrived. When a court decision finally becomes visible, it often feels abrupt, almost disconnected from everything that came before it. For many observers, the gap between long stretches of silence and a concrete ruling creates the impression that something shifted suddenly. In reality, that shift usually happened much earlier. By this stage, the case has already been shaped through discovery limits, testimony boundaries, and interpretive constraints. The court is no longer weighing broad possibilities. It is applying established legal standards to a narrowed set of facts. What remains is not uncertainty, but resolution mechanics. The reason outcomes feel sudden is largely about visibility. Courts do not announce when arguments lose relevance, when theories are quietly set aside, or when consensus begins forming around the remaining issues. Those determinations happen through review and deliberation, not through public-facing filings. When a decision appears, it reflects months of internal refinement rather than a reaction to the most recent event. Public discussion often links outcomes to the last headline or filing people remember. That creates confusion. The decision is assumed to be a response to something recent, when it is actually the result of procedural groundwork laid far earlier. This misalignment feeds the sense that the court changed direction, when in fact it followed a consistent path the entire time. In cases involving recognizable figures such as Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and parties connected through It Ends With Us, that effect is amplified. Visibility increases emotional investment, while the legal process remains indifferent to reaction. Courts do not reward momentum, outrage, or confidence. They respond to records that meet defined standards. This stage often reveals a core truth about litigation. By the time the public sees an outcome, the most meaningful decisions have already been made quietly. The ruling itself is simply the final expression of a process that has been narrowing all along. Understanding this helps reframe disappointment or surprise. Outcomes rarely answer every question raised publicly. They address only what survived procedural scrutiny. And once that becomes clear, the final stage of the case stops feeling like a twist and starts looking like the inevitable result of a process few people were actually watching in real time. Because once the outcome arrives, the most revealing question isn't what the court decided, it's why so many people expected something entirely else. By the time a case reaches its final phase, the legal outcome itself often carries less explanatory power than the process that produced it. What matters most is not just what the court decides, but how that decision came to be shaped long before it appeared publicly. This case illustrates that distinction clearly. From the outside, attention has centered on personalities, public statements, and perceived momentum. From the inside, the court's focus has remained consistent: procedure, relevance, and admissibility. Everything else, speculation, narrative confidence, and online certainty, has existed parallel to the process, not inside it. One of the most revealing aspects of this dispute is how early assumptions hardened into expectations. Once the public settled on a story, later procedural developments were filtered through that lens, even when the legal framework had already moved on. That gap between perception and process explains much of the confusion surrounding where the case now stands. For figures like Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and others connected to It Ends With Us and Wayfarer Studios, visibility amplified attention but did not alter standards. Courts do not weigh reputation, intent inferred from commentary, or narrative alignment. They evaluate records that survive scrutiny, nothing more. This doesn't mean the public conversation was irrelevant. It shaped perception, influenced media framing, and established expectations, but it did not shape the legal outcome. The law moved independently, narrowing issues quietly while attention remained fixed elsewhere. Understanding that separation is crucial, not just for interpreting this case, but for recognizing how high-profile litigation functions more broadly. Visibility creates confidence, procedure creates outcomes. When those two move out of sync, surprise becomes inevitable. In the end, the case does not resolve every question people debated early on. It resolves only the questions that fit within the boundaries the court enforced. Everything else fades, not because it lacked interest, but because it lacked procedural weight. That distinction between what feels decisive and what actually is the real takeaway here. And once you recognize how quietly cases are shaped long before decisions appear, it becomes easier to see why outcomes so often feel unexpected, and why the process matters more than the noise surrounding it. At this point, it's understandable if the conversation surrounding this case feels exhausting. High-profile disputes invite certainty long before courts invite conclusions. Opinions harden early, narratives lock in, and by the time the legal process reaches its final stages, many people feel they already know how things should end. But the process doesn't care about certainty. What this case demonstrates, quietly but clearly, is how much distance can exist between public confidence and procedural reality. Courts don't resolve stories, they resolve records, and those records are shaped slowly, deliberately, and often out of sight. For anyone following cases like this, involving recognizable figures and familiar projects, the most useful takeaway isn't allegiance or prediction. It's understanding how outcomes are built, why some arguments disappear without explanation, why silence often means progress, and why decisions that feel sudden are usually the product of months of narrowing that few people were watching. Whether this case ultimately confirms or challenges early expectations, the lesson remains the same. Paying attention to the process tells you far more than reacting to the noise around it. If you want to follow how these cases actually move, not how they're framed online, that's what this channel is here for. Thanks for watching.